Welcome to the Story Talks Back. Almost everything that we remember, think about, or imagine is a story. Stories entertain us, inform us, and even define us. They have upsides, and they have downsides. This podcast explores the power of story in every aspect of our lives. I'm Dave Stanton. Thank you for joining us. Herold has been immersed in the world of story shaping for over 4 decades. As the managing editor of the Los Angeles Times Magazine, and then Los Angeles Magazine, she worked with prize-winning writers and many others, helping to shape hundreds of human interest features, as well as coverage of the arts, sports, food, nature, and other topics. As a professor at the University of Southern California, she schooled several generations of journalism students in the arts of copy editing and line editing, as well as magazine writing. She's also a prize-winning writer in her own right, specializing in stories on travel, food, bird watching, and many of her other passions. She's currently working on a variety of freelance writing and editing assignments. Thank you for coming to join us on the Story Talks Back, Anne. Really appreciate your taking the time to talk to us. And just wanted to sort of start with a look at your history with stories. So we know that, you devoted your career to teaching copy editing, into shaping thousands of different stories at the LA Times Magazine and Los Angeles Magazine. But from what you remember, what's your sense of your first contact with stories, or some of the early stories that really resonated with you and maybe got you interested in writing and storytelling?
Yeah, and also just to add to the biography, toward the end of my time at USC, I was teaching magazine writing. And in fact, one of my last classes, the best student in the class is now an editor of GQ magazine. And previously, another really great student is now a senior editor at Wired.
Oh, cool.
Who came out of that program. So it was interesting to be able to specialize in magazine writing, which is the most of the forms of journalistic writing, is the most challenging, but also the way in which you can tell the most complex story.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was wonderful to be able to teach it. And then the editing class had to evolve over time from pure copy editing to line editing. And that was about 10 years in, because it was becoming apparent, as you make the point in our previous discussions, that there's fewer and fewer editors, that newspapers were sort of, as they were constricting, they were laying off editors. And it was a combination of copy editors and line editors. So you sort of had to be your own best copy editor and your own best line editor too, which are two very different skill sets, because you weren't necessarily going to get a good line editor. So the class had to quickly expand into line editing. So I reorganized it so it spent X amount of time on copy editing, a small amount of time on design, which was becoming less and less important as things moved online anyway. And then but design was fun, and actually the students often wished they could have more of it because it was such a creative, fun, visceral, visual thing. And then I had to really beef up the line editing part because they weren't getting any line editing. So you can't improve as a writer unless somebody's giving you really great line edits and notes on your writing, and especially in magazines. You can sort of get away with it in a typical sort of news story or a news feature. Once you get into long form writing, what we call literary journalism, so magazine writing, it's so challenging to write well, because it's like writing a mini book. It's like writing, it has to be organized properly, it has to have a terrific voice. It has to have good timing and pacing, and it has to, what I call, it has to take out the things that are going to stop the story cold in its tracks. And we used to call it in the business, killing the babies. So you have these things that you're in love with that you want to tell in your story. It's material, or it may even be word choices. It may even be language that you just love that you came up with, but it's stopping the story in its tracks. And so you either have to be able to, you either have a line editor who sort of says, no, you've gone off into the woods here, to your typical reader. You need to come out of the woods and get back onto the path. But you love the trip that you've taken into the woods. You love it. You love the views. You love the butterflies you saw. You love the flowers. But you don't realize that you've now lost 90% of the people who are on the path with you are not going into the woods. So, to be able to have an editor point that out to you is sort of critical, unless you can see it yourself. And it's interesting to look at what I call the great writers. It's what they don't put in. You can see it sometimes. And you think, oh, they were probably tempted to go into the woods right there and talk about this, and they didn't. They kept on the path. And so they brought home the story, much more effectively than if they'd gone into the woods on this pretty little side trip that unfortunately is going to derail you. And also that magazine readers are different from book readers. It's a different audience. They're committed to you, but they're committed to you to a point. A book reader is somebody who's sort of saying, I'm in this for the long haul. I'll even get through the bumpy bits. Like when you read The Goldfinch, there's moments where you're kind of going, oh, her epic novel. And then you get to this magical part where you think, I'm so glad I stuck with this. And then, and it's the same thing in magazine writing too, but you have an audience that's a little more inclined to kind of go, okay, now I'm done. I'm going to go and move on to the next story because this is becoming tedious to me to keep up with everything that's going on. All these side trips into the woods. I don't want to go into the woods anymore. I want to stay on this path. Mm-hmm. And so it was really interesting expanding the class into line editing. And getting them to think like line editors, which is about content. It's not just about, did you put in the commas correctly? It's, what decisions are you making about content? What are the adjectives you're choosing? What does your story sound like? Is it musical? And what kind of music is it? Is it staccato? Is it something else? Adagio? Is it, that's what, and they kind of got it. I mean, especially I think as they started reading for musicality, they started to hear writers' voices. And writers' voices are the most compelling gift that they have. Susan Orlean does not sound like Bill Finnegan, does not sound like Adam Gopnik, does not sound like, you can go through the great magazine writers of our time, and they all sound very different from John McPhee. I mean, you can pick up a John McPhee piece and go, oh, you don't even see the byline. You go, that's John McPhee. So, that's, I think, the thing that I wanted them to be able to attain. And it was hard because they also had to do some basic, just good writing and not ignore the grammar, punctuation, and vocabulary, and, move from that into some really sophisticated thinking in terms of the choices they were making, structuring the story.
So when you were at college age, I mean, were you already going in the direction of writing and journalism?
It's interesting because I look at some of my, I was a writer from the very beginning, and I don't remember it, but Paul Verkaman, whom who's now a CNN reporter, and is famous for his storytelling. Charles Kuralt was his hero, who's the great storyteller of American broadcast journalism. And he says, you remember that you won that writing award, you were the best writer in the school. And he sends me a copy of it, this piece I'd written, and I'd completely forgotten about it. It was like, but then later I found a little book that the nun had given me. Oh, Anne, congratulations for winning the writing award. And there was this lovely little book, darling little book that I shoved into a drawer. And
this was in high school?
No, this is in grade school.
Oh, wow.
This is in elementary school. And, Paul and I went through the same Catholic schools. So he remembered this. I had forgotten it. Then I get to high school, and I think I'm quite the writer. Because everyone's told me I'm very good. And my freshman English teacher, Mr. Walsh, gives me F's on the first pieces that I write for his English class. F, language too purple. Okay, you're overdoing it. Too many adjectives, too many adverbs. Think about what and it was such a shock. And yet it was galvanizing, because it was like, I can do this. And, I started to be careful about selecting my adverbs and adjectives, and I started to calm down my writing. It was less flowery and hyperbolic. And then I started getting A's, and I realized that the writing was getting better. And
he was your first copy editor.
My first line editing too. When you think about it, he was sort of saying, you're making some bad choices. You think you're very impressive with your flowery language. You're not. You've gone into the woods and you're picking all the brightest flowers, and we're not impressed, because we would like to look at the pretty leaf on the tree and study the pretty leaf on the tree. You're not letting us. You're throwing flowers at us. And I would often do that. I speak in these kind of analogies or metaphors or whatever the correct word would be, because sometimes that allows students to kind of get an image in their head that seems real. It's not just talking about writing in a very technical way. It's talking about writing in a way that it's emotional. And I would use sports metaphors. That would sometimes be a way to and I could see them kind of think, they got it. The sports metaphors worked. The nature metaphors worked. All these things were an emotional way of talking about writing, which allowed them to relax. It wasn't going to be something like physics that was so technically difficult. If they didn't get the math, they were doomed. That wasn't what it was. It was about making some interesting choices in terms of how you write. And letting go of things and pushing yourself a little bit to improve. Don't go for the obvious adjective or adverb, or don't go for this sentence structure that becomes repetitive and sort of monotonous, and look at what other writers are doing. And if another writer's really moving you, what are they doing? Is it the way that they're structuring the sentence? Is it the way that they present the information? Is it the tension they create? And then the moment where they let you just sort of sit back and be quiet, and then they put you back into a bit of a tumult. So it's things like that. And magazine writers can do that because it's long form. It's a mini book. And so you're challenged to create a mini book. And you can jump from the mini book into fiction. And you see that in some of the great writers. They would jump back and forth between magazines and books.
When you were starting to write, who were the writers that you admired? Who sort of pushed you in that direction?
Oh, it's interesting. It was funny because you had a question about the first stories. And the ones I might have heard that were, because there's the verbal stories you hear, and then there are the ones you read. And right. The verbal ones always came from my mother, because she was Swiss and she had a real interest also in history, not only family history, but just history in general. So, you know, I grew up in a community that's really rich in history, Montecito, California, which had been home to an interesting mix of people, from robber barons who moved out to the West Coast for their health and built these gorgeous estates, to, you know, some really thriving early Latino communities, predominantly Mexican. And my mother was fascinated by them. They called the first Mexican settlement in Montecito, they called it Spanish Town, but it was actually Mexicans who had been allowed to come and create their own little town in Montecito. They had their own bordello and their own store and their own hotel and their own graveyard and their own everything. It's still there. And so, you know, so you had this really diverse community. My mother understood all the history, but she was also interested in the history of our own family. And there was my great-grandfather was 13 when he left Switzerland, crawled across the Panama Canal because there was no canal, and made his way to San Francisco and worked his way down California until he ended up in North Santa Barbara County, and worked his butt off and made enough money to buy land, you know, which is of course what you did. And bought farmland here and farmland there, and ranch land here and ranch land there. And they struck oil on one of his little properties. It turned out to be the Santa Maria oil fields. So then he was rich. And by that time, I think my grandfather was 9 or 10. So he remembered California very fondly. So they go back to Switzerland, but he never forgot how much he liked California. And as a child. So I heard all these stories growing up of this really interesting sort of immigrant history and this early California history too. And so my traipses around Montecito, I'd often come back to my mother and say, well, what about this house? And she would tell me the history of this house, which would be fascinating, whoever had built it and who the architect that was involved. And maybe some famous landscape person had come in and done a fabulous little, you know, one-of-a-kind succulent garden. I mean, the people who came to Montecito from the East were just blown away by what you could do in this California climate. I mean, just blown away. And that it could look like, you know, the parts of Europe they love, Spain and Italy, the Mediterranean. So they went nutty and built, you know, all these incredible Mediterranean style, you know, buildings, which, you know, makes it a beautiful place to be. So I heard that, and then I was reading stories, the two that really stuck with me, and one of them has just been remade as a movie, The Secret Garden, which is Frances Hodgson Burnett.
Sure.
And if you talk to most girls who read that, that book, you can literally find that book as having defined most young girls. I'm not sure if that's still the case, but it was and then another one called Sarah Crew, which was about a girl who's orphaned, she thinks, and she's sent to go live in this garret, and she's got this magic life. She was living in India when her parents died. So she ends up in this garret, and she's got all these beautiful tapestries that she managed to bring from India, and she sort of decorates the room. And she's living in this little garret, and nobody wants her, nobody loves her, but she loves herself, and she just loves her memories of India and her parents. And then some strange rich uncle comes out of nowhere and sort of rescues her. And so it's this story of, and you know, The Secret Garden is the same story too. It's sort of abandoned children who find, you know, that they can have a life even when the adults are ignoring them. And in the case of The Secret Garden, it's each other in this magic garden in which they can make this beautiful life appear out of the earth. And then in the case of Sarah Crew, it's that she held on to her memories of these incredible parents and of India, the beauty of India. And then, you know, she's rescued. She somehow survives, you know, and she's kind of in the end rescued by this, you know, insanely rich uncle, and now she has the life of a princess That she always imagined she was, because, you know, she had to, or she would have, you know, died of depression. So I remember those stories. So they were about girls who were independent, confident little things, and that could also be great Imagineers.
Right.
And I thought
There's
that
also
was,
the theme
and
of
a lot of girls have read those stories and kind of go, oh yeah, that book, oh, that changed my life. So, and then I think from there, you know, then I was plunged into everything. I mean, I read To Kill a Mockingbird and just was gobsmacked by, you know, that book. And other books that made me politically aware at a very early age. I read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee when I was 18. I couldn't stop crying. And now when I kind of look at what people are getting upset about, you know, there's a lot of animosity being directed at Padre Sarah right now in California, but I'm kind of like, do you remember when you massacred the Sioux at Wounded Knee? Is anybody remembering that? Do you remember the Trail of Tears when the Cherokees were marched across the plains and died, and the Apaches who were wiped out? So, you know, if you read well and you read widely and you never stop, your world gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And also, I think, and I would try to encourage aspiring writers, you hear more and more voices. And you're also going to hear more and more stories and you're going to say, why did that stick with me? What was it about that? So they inform you emotionally, but they can also inform you as a writer. Does that make sense? And then I want to bring up one other thing, because it's a different kind of storytelling. And I was thinking about this a lot. One of the defining things for me, because I grew up in the 60s, you know, in a really tumultuous, iconoclastic time, was the photojournalism that was going on at the time, and what Life magazine was doing. And you would look at Life magazine and your life changed forever. They did the series on the day in the life of a gun, you know, and they chronicled the people that were killed across America in one day by guns. And I'll never forget it. It was like, early on, it was sort of like, we have to get rid of guns. I mean, look at this poor housewife in Wisconsin, you know, look at this poor little 12-year-old in Watts. Look at this. I mean, you literally looked across America and you just went, you know, guns are completely blind to who you are, you know, what you aspire to. They just kill. And then there was the week in Vietnam where they showed you the pictures of every man that was killed in Vietnam in a 1 week period of time. And again, it was the same thing. You know, it just went across the spectrum from these poor 18-year-olds from Newark to some guy who'd gone to Harvard, who'd been an officer, you know, it was just staggering. And then you saw the human toll. And then there was another, you know, just everything they did. In fact, there was a point where I thought about going back and getting a master's in history, because I think that journalism is history in the making. It's writing about history as it happens. And so I went with that idea to the history department at USC, and I said, you know, well, first I went to UCLA because it was cheaper. I went to UCLA and they said, oh, no, you know, our history, we don't even want to hear your ideas. You commit yourself to us for 2 years and we tell you what you're going to study, and you can't work and you can't. And I just went, no, okay, bye. And went to USC and talked to them, and they said, oh, and I told him the idea and he went, oh my God, that's amazing. And I said, I want to interview everyone who covered Vietnam. And I want to talk about how the coverage of the Vietnam War changed American foreign policy.
Wow.
And that would have included Jack.
Sure.
You know, Jack would have been in that mix. And he loved it. I mean, he was just like, oh, that's fabulous. And I thought, this is great. I don't even have to go through old stuff. I can talk to people. I can talk to Neil Sheehan. I can talk to everybody, you know, who's important in the coverage of the Vietnam War, and they can tell me. Then I can talk to politicians who are still living, and about what the impact of that 10-year war. And so that was so exciting. I mean, I didn't end up doing it because the cost was intimidating. I mean, but
they wound up doing it on their own. Remember, they did that Vietnam Reconsidered thing.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so at what point, going back to, sort of your formative years with writing, where was the point where you became more of an editor than a writer, that you sort of made that?
Well, no, actually, it was more of an editor than a writer. So what I kind of realized as I was going through the journalism program at USC was that I had a skill set that was very rare and marketable, which was I was an extremely good copy editor. I understood grammar, punctuation, word usage better than any of my classmates, and there's a reason for that, but we'll circle back to that. So, I had this incredible skill set that was very marketable. If I were a writer or reporter, I'd be competing with an incredible pool of talent. And I knew that. I thought, I'm not, and I really thought I wasn't as good as those guys. It was like, I am really good at this grammar stuff. I'm better than people with 20 years experience, and I'm 20 something. So it's my route, because that's going to move me along more effectively and more securely than if I have to compete with this incredible pool of writers and reporters. There were some amazing people converging in LA at that time.
Do you think there was any kind of sexism in that? Did you feel like you would have less of a chance as a writer?
No, it was more this East Coast bias. At that time, the LA Times was struggling. It was in the shadow of the New York Times, which sort of dominated, what I would call the journalistic bragging circles.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a real, you could sort of see in the hiring at the LA Times, the New York reporters would get favorable treatment. So anybody coming out of the big papers in the East, so out of the Boston, at that time, the Boston Globe, out of the Washington Post. And remember, the Washington Post has just scored a coup with Watergate. So, because we're talking about the late 70s. So you've got all these people, and the New York papers, and Newsday at that time was a very good paper. So even the Long Island paper was terrific. There were papers, throughout the East that were well regarded, Philadelphia Inquirer. So those guys would get the kind of, oh, we love you, come out and work for us kind of salutations from the editors at the LA Times. And as a Westerner, you were sort of looked down upon a little bit, like, well, you haven't been, in the great media markets. And then, Otis changed all that, because when he really turned all his great thinking and attention and money,
Otis Champion,
to building the LA Times into a paper as great as the New York Times. And he did that, he did that by the time the LA Times was sold. And so these incredible people who were coming from all over the country. I mean, one of their great hires, Dan Neal, came out of South Carolina, and it was working at some tiny, stupid little nothing paper. But he had caught the attention of, now I'm going to blank on his name, who the editor when Dean Baquet was the managing editor. Dean Baquet now being the editor of the New York Times. So he caught the attention of this gentleman who was a well-regarded editor out of Baltimore. He'd run the Baltimore Sun. And he was changing, he was continuing this great change at the LA Times. He brings Dan Neal in, and for the first time ever, a car columnist. This guy wrote on cars. He was but you would read his car columns, and he had a cult following, because you would learn about astronomy, you would learn about the economics of Brazil, you would learn about, Dan approached every car column as a possible chance to introduce you to some interesting thing that he knew, that he was excited about. and he never knew what it was.
Mm.
And so he was this incredible, omnivorous mind with incredible writing talent. And he could use cars as a window into 50 different subjects in a year. I mean, it was just, we would all kind of just, we were just, he now works for the Wall Street Journal. So that, you know, that was sort of, you could sort of see that they got the talent could come from anywhere, that it wasn't necessarily an East Coast right. It was, you know, they could find it in this tiny little town in South Carolina. So it was really exciting time. And that's when you sort of saw things moving. And there were some incredible people who were brought on as writers and reporters who came out of, again, nowhere. You know, they just happened to be really good at what they did. And maybe they were working at a small paper in Idaho or Colorado or Montana or whatever, but they distinguished themselves for, so talent rather than pedigree became
Right.
your calling card. But, you know, at that point, I wasn't in their league. Even then, you know, being a copy editor. Then when I got hired at the Sunday magazine in '91, that's when everything, then it was possible to be an editor, but also be a writer and be a line editor. So I could start to expand, you know, into other areas. Because at a magazine, you had to sort of be a jack of all trades. You weren't just typecast as this. You had to, yeah.
And how did your approach to editing and working with writers change over the years?
You know, working for magazines, because magazines haven't really had to change, you know, they're not, some of them are not what they were. I mean, I look at I just got my latest Vanity Fair. And I think to myself, you know, Vanity Fair used to be 2 inches thick and have some of the greatest writing in the universe. I mean, I actually used him in a class, in a magazine writing class. Jürgen Hilmer, who wrote The Perfect Storm, was embedded in Afghanistan for Vanity Fair, of all things. I mean, who writes, you know, carries, Vanity Fair was running a war correspondent out of Afghanistan, and that became the documentary Restrepo. I don't know if you ever saw it, but it was just genius. Documentary about Afghanistan and the war there and the guys who were fighting there. It was amazing. And I remember coming across it and making my class read it because it was just amazing writing. And of all things in Vanity Fair, which was supposed to be high-end society coverage, and yet you had this. So, you know, magazines were constantly surprising. And even now, Wired is like my favorite, besides The New Yorker, my favorite magazine, because you're going to read some of the best coverage of the earth sciences, the biological sciences, cultural, you know, studies, research. It's in Wired, of all places, which is supposed to be a tech magazine. So, and even golf, I tell people this, I've read some of the best writing about cultural issues has been in Golf Digest, of all things, because they'll use profiles or pieces about how golf is changing as a way to tell a story about how our society is changing. And who'd have thunk, you know, it never ceases to amaze me. And that's, again, a sign of good editing and writing. That means somebody was thinking at Golf Magazine, let's just not write about how to putt better. Let's write about the guy who came out of the swamps of Georgia, you know, and became the greatest, you know, young pro out of the South. And what his origin story is and what he has to tell people about, that you don't have to be part of the country club set to become a great golfer. So I think that that's what a magazine, that's what I sort of got from magazines, was you can tell stories not only in a really interesting number of ways, but the way you tell them and what you decide to write about can be surprisingly original, creative, innovative. So, that was the exciting part. And I always urge people, just keep reading magazines, please, because that news feed that you've got on your computer is terrible. So if you want to learn more about the world, do that.
So, in terms of your own work, I mean, you feel like your approach to working with authors was pretty much the same throughout the time that you.
Yeah, it was really interesting because you get a variety in any magazine. You get a variety of people who are the best at what they do. And I think I told you this story before. I edited a number of Pulitzer Prize winning long form writers and considered some of the greatest literary journalists of their time. And, I might change 5 commas and 2 semicolons and question 1 or 2 word choices. And they acted like I had just saved them from perdition. And it was because they cared that much about literally every single piece of that bit of that story. It's what made them great. And then there were other people where I had to rewrite them from top to bottom, because I would try to sort of guide them into what they needed to do to elevate their stories. And after 3 rounds of not getting what I needed, I would just sit down and say, just give me the piece. And I would just rewrite it myself. And by then I usually had enough information, because I had sent them back for this and more of this and re-interview somebody to get this. And sometimes it was interesting with writers. It was like, they would think that 1 interview was enough. And I'd say, no, sometimes you're going to go back 2 or 3. And I would tell the students this, you're going to go back 2 or 3 times. So leave the door open when you and I used to do this when I would interview people. I would say, I might be listening to transcript, looking at the transcripts and listening to what we talked about. And I may need to call you because I may have forgotten to do something. Is that all right? And I left the door open because I wanted to be able to call back and sort of say, can we talk some more? Because a great interviewer has to completely put themselves out of the picture and ask the right questions and, really listen to somebody's story and not think about yourself for 1 second, and observe everything. And at the same time that you're asking them questions, you're keeping them talking. Because I would say that the one thing about the students that distressed me toward the end of my teaching was how little they observed. And observation is so key to writing. And every great novelist talks about this. They'll be watching something or overhearing a conversation. They'll be making notes secretly, because they realize that what they are seeing or observing, or the thought they're having about the way the light looks on that mirror at that particular moment of the day in that Parisian cafe, is something they don't want to forget, because they've had this moment of I know how I want to talk about this. I know how I want to describe it. So they'll write it down, or they'll overhear a conversation, they'll write it down, or they'll have a thought and they'll write it down. They don't expect to remember it, and they're willing to observe. And I would sometimes just be amazed. I'd kick stories back to writing students and just say, I have no sense of what this place looked like, what that person looked like, what their body language was like, what color were their eyes. I mean, you look at a good New Yorker piece, and at some point there's that step back where you get the visual, You see what that person looks like. You see what that room looks like. You see so you're in the picture. Now you have a visual. This is, I think, important, especially where the landscape plays a part in your understanding or your appreciation of the story that's being told. And students couldn't do it. They couldn't. They were like, I said, what are you looking at? you looking at your phone? Are you looking at your fingernails? Are you looking
Is that
at
what
them?
you
Are
think?
you looking at the stuff in the room? I mean,
Do you think that's the problem, that they spend a lot of time looking at their phones and so
yeah,
they're used to
yeah,
observing? Or
yeah. They stop observing the real world.
hmm.
And I would say to all of them, observe the real world. It's never the same virtually. It's really important to observe. And that's why I was sort of excited about the mindfulness craze of the late 90s, early aughts, because there was a moment where people were saying to each other, we need to stop being in our heads and we need to be more mindful. You know,
Mm-hmm.
we need to look at nature. We need to focus on one thing instead of 50 million things we're supposed to be doing, you know. And that was kind of exciting because it was like, I thought this mindfulness is good because it's important to have those moments where you stop and you truly observe something, especially as a writer.
Mm.
It's not the static, and turn off the static in your head and look and then try to describe it in your head.
Right.
And I would do that. I think I told you this. I would walk around my neighborhood in Montecito and I would try to write what I was seeing in my head when I was a little kid. Um, and I would pretend I was writing in the voice of this columnist for one of the women's magazines, Gladys Tabor. And she would write about, you know, just walking around her farm and what the vegetables were doing and what the Cocker Spaniel was doing and I would do the same thing, walking around my yard or walking around my neighborhood or walking with my Cocker Spaniel down the street. And I would, in my head, how would I write this? Well, if I were writing that column at Good Housekeeping or whatever women's magazine it was, what would it sound like? And I would write it in my head. So that was my early attempts at it. But then I did segue into editing because I had such a strong marketable skill set that it was unavoidable. And then I got to return to writing, you know, when I worked at magazines, because you had to do a little bit of everything. And then when I went to Los Angeles Magazine, by then, everybody who could write well had to write, because we couldn't afford to, you know, hire the freelance writers who wanted $5 a word. I remember when I talked to Bill Finnegan about writing for us, and Bill went, well, you know what I get per word? And I just kind of went, oh, don't tell me. Don't tell me, because we can't afford you. I know it. I'm sorry. He said, I'm sorry, I just can't come down. It's just, because Bill, just for people who don't know, grew up in LA and Hawaii.
Right.
So, and he has wonderful origin story, because he should never have been a great magazine journalist, because he was a hardcore surfer. So I would say Barbarian Days, which is his memoir of going from surfer to writer, is one of the best things you can read.
Right.
I think. Have you read it?
Yeah, I have actually. I love it.
What do you think?
Ah, so good.
I said to Bill when I interviewed him about the book when it came out, I said, Bill, dude, nobody jumps from hardcore surfer to the New Yorker. He goes, I know. Can you believe it? So it was really fun, you know, because he had that moment where he's like, right place, right time, you know, write everything. Because he was writing for the New Yorker he was teaching in South Africa, because he was surfing in South Africa. And he was teaching in a township, and there was an uprising, and because it was a black township, and you know, he was writing for the New Yorker, and they loved what he was doing. And so they were like, can you do more? And would you mind coming back to the United States? And,
Funny.
you know, I literally went, dude, this just doesn't happen. And he goes, I know. I know. Because there is sort of usually a process. And then to get to the digital, you know, how is digital storytelling changed what we do?
That was my next question.
Yeah, the upside is everybody gets to write. The downside is everybody gets to write. And I think you may know what I mean. So there's an awful lot of people who are abusing it. you know, with their own agendas. And you can just look at the QAnon phenomenon and just, you know, it's horrible. And it's, so a lot of people anointed themselves as writers and experts and citizen journalists, and they have no right, they have no, how do I put this?
Business.
They have no business, thank you. They have no business doing it. They're terrible at it. You know, they're self-absorbed, they're small thinkers, they're liars in some case, QAnon. So fake news. And I think that this is what worries me, because that's where you had, before digital storytelling, there was a filter. Now, granted, it was a problematic filter. To get published, you had to go run a gauntlet. You had to pitch a good story. Then you had to write a good story or work with an editor to write a good story. And then you got it published in a newspaper or a magazine or some other publication, or you got a book published. And, you know, there's been a lot of talking now about, well, you know, now there needs to be more diversity in storytelling and book publishing. And, but when you think about it, books have always been, I mean, we've read some amazing things about cultures we know nothing about because of the books that were written and published by great human beings, and great writers.
Mm.
And they deserve to be published. And I think there's an idea that there was a certain discrimination against telling certain cultural stories by the publishing houses. And I don't think that was necessarily the case. What I think happened, what I sort of saw happening in writing was that, you know, every publishing house was like any other business. It was looking for the big kill. It was looking for the blockbuster. So you would, you know, they were always looking for those writers who were going to make them $1 zillion, you know, the blockbuster type writers. And that subsidized the smaller voice, you know, the smaller audiences. The books that were more specialized in their audiences, although everybody should have read them. So, you know, that was sad because it was about the business of publishing. And that meant that, you know, they had to go for, it's a little bit like movie making, go for the blockbuster. Well, you don't tell the best stories in the blockbuster movies often, the ones that make money, but it's those smaller independent films that change your life, you know, or those smaller independent books written by, you know, authors.
Isn't it also a self-fulfilling prophecy? I mean,
Sorry?
Isn't it also a self-fulfilling prophecy that if nobody big ever gets behind, you know, a non-mainstream movie, that it's never going to be big?
Well, that's the whole thing. So you've got some interesting, who's the guy that did Hunt for the Wilder People, that did Jojo Rabbit? The guy from New Zealand. And he acts in Jojo Rabbit. He's sort of, to me, that great story of somebody who's sort of saying, I can tell an idiosyncratic story. Now, Hunt for the Wilder People is a cult. You know, it's one of the best movies I've ever seen, but most people haven't seen it.
Hmm.
You know, it had a quick in and out of the theaters, and we all told each other, you got to see this movie. I mean, it's just phenomenal. It's set in New Zealand, which is where he's from. And then he comes out with, but that movie did enough kind of, you could sort of see this, it had this incredible ripple effect because everybody was talking about it. And it ended up staying in the theaters a little longer, I think, than anybody expected, and made more money than anybody expected. That gave him the purchase to be able to do Jojo Rabbit, which is genius. And, you know, he acts in it. He plays the Nazi, he plays Hitler in the movie. Why can't I remember his name? Because I love him. It's a Maori name. So, you know, you kind of think it can happen. It can happen. but it takes incredible perseverance and confidence and all those things. And he's, again, half Maori, so he's able to, now he can tell that story, because the Maoris are not exactly the most, how would you put it, inclusive people in New Zealand. Right. I mean, they're better off than the Aborigines in Australia, but so, I kind of think it can happen. I think it has happened. It's kind of exciting when it does. I think this pandemic is going to, cause us to do some resets. But I couldn't even predict what it's going to mean for Hollywood. I kind of see what it means for newspapers. It's hard. Magazines, it's hard. And I'm hopeful, because there's been some great journalism that people are moving toward it, because they also sort of realize they want to be better informed about things, I think. But I'm not sure. That's my hope. And that's where the great storytelling comes in, And then, again, let's never undercount books that come out of nowhere, like H is for Hawk. So Helen McDonald's book that became a bestseller and that's now becoming a movie. I mean, that was a book written, it should never have been a bestseller in a lot of weird ways. And it became a bestseller, and it set her up, So now Helen McDonald is a force of, and she's got, I think, a new book. Oh, she's got the book about the Swifts. So now she has a new book coming out that's going to be a bestseller. And it's about her obsession with these birds called swifts, which never stop flying. And, and again, the success of H is for Hawk, which again should never have been a bestseller, gave her that purchase to be able to write a book about, of all things, a bird that never stops flying. That's going to become a bestseller, And she's an amazing writer, but H is for Hawk is about how grief over the loss of her father almost killed her. Have you read it?
Yeah.
Oh, anybody who loses a parent, I say you have to read H is for Hawk. And the grief, it's about how you survive that grief. And I won't say anything more, and it'll make you want to read T.H. White's Once and Future King, if you've never read it, because she references him repeatedly and that's a brilliant book. I recommend that one to I have a long list of writers that I recommend to people, and they're everything from, Mark Helprin to Mario Vargas Llosa to, I love, and I'm a big fan of John Irving, especially some of the early things. And I'm a big fan of Tim Winton, who's Australia's #1 writer. I'm reading one of his latest book right now.
Huh.
So, and then The Overstory, which is Richard Powers, which won the Pulitzer a couple years ago, which is just one of the most amazing books I've ever read. So that's, a long list. And I was a big Iris Murdoch fan for a long time. I was a huge Joyce Carol Oates fan for a long time. And then I sort of saw that I kept hearing the same voice. And sometimes you can almost have too much of one voice, and then you kind of go, okay, now I'm going to move on to Jane Smiley, Horst Heavens, one of the best, Cormac McCarthy. I mean, wow. Don DeLillo, White Noise, one of the best things ever written. The guy who just wrote about Churchill, who wrote Devil in the White City. And I'm blanking on his name. But I'm interested to read his Churchill book. And I remember one of my friends sort of being dismissive and saying, well, hasn't everything that's to be written about Churchill been written? And I kind of went, well, apparently not. So, because I'm hearing good things about this book. So
what are you working on?
I was doing a lot of, so after I stopped working at I was doing some food writing for a little bit, and I wrote for one of the websites that will not be named, one of the more popular ones, and it was horrible. I was edited by millennials who introduced errors repeatedly in my stories. And so what I would have to do is, and I'd already told them, and I've won a James Beard Award for food writing, so I have some clout. And I said, you know, I get to see this story every time somebody touches it, or you're not going to get to publish it. I wrote actually 3 things for them, but 1 feature and then 2 guides. And I said, and the story about the feature kept coming back with errors introduced in it that were a combination of factual and language errors. And then I would make a list. I thought, well, I'm not going to blow up and yell because then I'll sound like an okay boomer. So I will just send them a list. Okay, well, you can't say this because this, and you can't use this word because you've misused it because of this, and here's where you wouldn't use a semicolon, and here's where, and there would be a long list every time. And I would just send it back. Then the story would come back, and they were more PC than I was. I mean, I remember they took out, well, we had a Hawaii expert look at it, and she's decided that this Hawaiian said something offensive about Hawaiians. And I just went, it's a Hawaiian talking about Hawaiians? Is he not allowed to say what he thinks about his people? And so it was the weirdest experience ever. And after it, I said, I will never write for millennials ever again, because it was just too hard to protect that story. And then it was funny because the story went it went online late than they said, or the original deadline. And so it gets posted, and Gary, and I'm not paying attention, Gary calls me and he says, your byline, the wrong byline is on your story. The editor had put her name on it mistakenly. And so right away I emailed her and I said, excuse me, you put your name as the byline?
That's a Freudian slip, right?
She went, oops. Oh, it was just total Freudian slip. Oops, and corrected it and put my name on it, which is the nice thing about digital. If you make a mistake,
right,
you can go in and fix it. But this was huge. I mean, Gary went, that's not your name on that story.
Are you working on anything else now?
Pardon me? Oh, so I've been doing some travel writing for various magazines, because travel writing is tough. It's harder than it looks. It's really important to be able to not just say, go eat this, go try that. You know, you have to sort of write about it without sounding kind of lame and repetitive. So it's really important to be able to weave in some of the landscape. So either it's historic or it's nature. Like when I wrote about this beautiful Central California area called Los Osos, which has some of the most beautiful nature you'll ever see. I wrote about the nature that's in this area. And that was fun. And then I wrote a travel story about Los Alamos, which is a town that goes back to the 1800s. I mean, they've repurposed, it's an old stagecoach stop that they repurposed. All these wealthy Angelenos who were abandoning careers as Sony executives and Universal Music executives and reinventing themselves as bakers were moving into this town and taking over these old buildings and turning them into bakeries and flatbread places and, dim sum houses and, seasonal. There's a chef who just won Best New Chef from Food and Wine, who cooked in New York at Per Se, which is Thomas Keller's restaurant. And she came back, she moved to Los Alamos and opened a little restaurant. She's just been named Best New Chef. In this tiny little town in the middle of stagecoach land. And it's literally a throwback. You walk down this one street in this one town, it's like you expect the gunslinger to come out with the pistols firing. And they've got old gas station pumps that go back to the 1920s. I mean, it's just an incredible place. A land that kind of time forgot, which is unique for California. And I did a huge cover story about them, the food and wine scene there. And boom, that was in February and the pandemic hit.
Oh, wow.
So they've done well. They've managed to, because they're these are experienced people. These are people who had big careers before they moved to this tiny little town. So they were able to think and pivot and reinvent themselves or figure out ways that they could work around the pandemic until they were allowed, because we have the weather, we can eat outside most of the year.
Right.
So they were able to figure out how to do it by going outside, and yay. But it was just, so it's been hard to watch, because I am I've been writing a lot of travel stories the last couple of years, to watch that industry just get shut down. I mean, and to miss that. I'm really missed traveling. And, I was lucky to be able to write about it. And I went to Idaho and did a story in Boise, which is an amazing town, not what you would expect at all, and did a piece about that. So yeah, it was travel writing the last couple of years, which again is a challenge, but fun. And you have to kind of know it's a specialized kind of writing, and you do need to cover certain territory. And I learned that because we did some good travel coverage at both the LA Times magazine and Los Angeles magazine. We had good travel editors and writers. So, and food people. I learned a lot. I worked for Saveur magazine as a ghost editor for years, which a lot of people don't know, because my name couldn't be on the masthead because the LA Times would have fired me. So, I did that and learned a lot about that whole world of that magical world of great food writing. Gourmet magazine, I mean, that was writing about food, but writing about something even bigger, the culture and the emotions and the dedication and the vision and the family ties, what food means to people around the world. And so watching this it's been hard to watch what happened to travel and to food, to restaurants, to that world. It's been really, really hard.
Thank you so much for talking to me, Anne. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been so fun to talk about it. I kind of leave you with this, because I was thinking about why people need to tell their stories, and this has been fun because it's like everybody needs to tell their origin story. And maybe they're going to tell it in a blog and they'll do it well, or maybe they're going to tell it in, Ed Cray, our friend,
right,
toward the end of his career at USC, he had started a memoir writing program. He had sort of laid out, and he'd done a lot of research about this. And he, of course, has written some incredible biographies. His book on Earl Warren is just the best thing that's ever been written on Earl Warren. And he had discovered that people really, really wanted to write memoirs. And he'd been working with, I think, maybe Iowa, maybe with the university or the writers' workshop there. And they wanted to introduce a sort of memoir writing category and he was sort of trying to get SC to adopt this memoir writing sort of program, because SC would have these international journalism programs, and they would do these specialized programs depending on who would come up with a formidable idea. Let's do specialized writing on this. Right. There was a good specialized sports writing program for a while. And I remember he was working on that, and he said people were desperate to tell their origin stories. And yet they needed help, because, you go in the woods, when you're telling your origin story sometimes. Right. So thank you if I've sometimes gone into the woods, but it was great to talk about something I care so much about. And I leave you with a picture of Ed Cray sort of getting the importance of storytelling, of telling your origin story. And that was sort of one of the last great things that he gave us.
Well, thank you so much, Anne. Okay.
Yeah, you're welcome. Have a good night. Talk to you soon.
All right. Appreciate it.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye. The Story Talks Back is produced and hosted by Dave Stanton. The music you're hearing now was written and performed by Christopher Daydream. The theme music at the beginning of our show is an excerpt from Play by Merlin Twelfhoven, performed by Kronos Quartet as part of their 50 for the Future series. Please subscribe to The Story Talks Back on Podbean and check us out on Instagram. See you next time.